Hello, welcome to the Brink podcast. It's back. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for being patient. I'm having some work done in the house, so recording things is an absolute nightmare. But hopefully this one will be fine. There might be some dogs snoring in the background, but hopefully not too distracting. So this week, talking about something really quite challenging, something very topical, something very prescient in our times. The best way I can describe it is the mood around us has soured. You can feel it everywhere. It's in the headlines, in algorithms, in conversations over kitchen tables. In the UK, where I am, the small boats, the kind of catch-all term, has become a shorthand for national anxiety. In the US, chants about walls still echo through rallies. And what binds them together, I think, is not just politics but psychology. A collective turn inward, suspicious, defensive, seeking simple answers in an increasingly complex world. And I feel it too. I've watched marches on TV. I've watched them move through my streets. I've seen hotels attacked not far from me. I've seen St George's crosses painted defiantly across roundabouts and street signs on my high street. These aren't abstract news stories to me. They've become lived realities. They've become things I see happening outside, and I know other people who see and feel it too. And that's why I wanted to tackle that this week, not from the safety of some distance armchair observer position, but from someone who is living this in their everyday life. Because the truth is, I see this mood in my friendship group, in the spaces I spend time in the people I care about. And the question gnaws at me is that I come back to time and time again is why? This article, this podcast, this video is an attempt to make sense of that. Not to judge, but to understand, to hold up psychology and history as mirrors to this moment, and to ask what forces, emotional, economic, technological, have brought us here, and to wonder out loud, is there anything that can be done to soften this anger, to shift the rhythm, to imagine a less fearful future? So I want to start not by looking at psychology, but by looking at history. So we know that history has a rhythm. It doesn't march forward neatly, it circles back, it repeats, it brings back stuff that we'd rather forget. And in times of crisis, that isn't just a test of economies and institutions, it's a test of the collective psyche, how we process, how we remember. And when things get really, really bad, the things that remain really common throughout history is fear thickens in the air, trust thins out, and suddenly hard edges feel way safer than soft ones. We've been here before. So after financial crashes, far-right parties always surge. The data on this is wild. So across 20 democracies spanning 140 years, extremist vote shares jumped by nearly a third in the aftermath of financial crises. Insecurity makes simple stories seductive, and what these parties do so well is they get blame and they turn it into a balm. Let's take a look at an example. It's the 1930s and it's in Germany. The economy is battered, it is humiliated after the war. Communities are gripped by huge loss, and into that vacuum poured radio. It was a new medium at the time, and what it brought was an intimacy and an unrelenting nature that the printing press couldn't do. In German regions where the signal for radio stations was stronger, support for the Nazi Party was way higher. And it didn't stop at the ballot box. Those same areas later showed more anti-Semitic violence because fear had found a frequency and hatred had found an amplifier. Now, this idea of technology and ideology, I'm going to come back to later to explain that about what's new about now. But today, for now, just stay there. But wasn't just the 1930s that did this. We saw it in the 1970s and 80s. Oil shocks and inflation sent societies searching for security. The law and order politics rose not just because crime increased, but because uncertainty did. Reagan, Thatcher, other political right-wingers who used a form of control and violence to tell people that without it they would be robbed of everything that they held dear. And by the 1990s, cable news had turned this mood into a 24-hour spectacle, narrating fear until it felt just like part of the furniture. And then came 2008, another collapse, another wave of insecurity, and this time the political centre just cracked wide open. Across Europe and America, mainstream parties shrank in how many people would sign up for them, polarisation started to grow, and the ground was laid for what we see on the telly today. The migrants are now the threat, elites are corrupt, and nostalgia is the only salvation that most of us seem to have. I certainly feel that way. So when I see anger on the streets now, the marches, the flags, the sense that something essential is being attacked, I try to remind myself that this is not happening in a vacuum. It is part of a rhythm, a cycle where instability breeds fear, and fear makes the politics of exclusion feel like safety. History tells us this, and psychology, which I'm going to talk about now, explains why it works. It's easy to frame what you see on the news or on social media as a cultural thing. It's about flags, it's about borders, it's about identity. But underneath these symbols, I think, sits something more concrete. Money, jobs, survival. Economics doesn't explain everything, but it explains more than we'd like to admit, I think. Because when people lose work, when wages stagnate, when bills outpace earnings, fear stops being some abstract idea. It sits in the chest, and fear, when left untended, almost always looks for someone to blame. And the numbers depressingly always back this up. In the US, the so-called China shock, the wave of factory closures and job losses triggered by rising imports, reshaped the political map. Communities most exposed to these changes didn't just grow poorer, they became more polarised, and voters in those communities drifted towards harder, more extreme options. In the UK, we see the same idea. The areas hit hardest by deindustrialisation, austerity, trade disruption, Brexit were also the ones where UKIP flourished and the Leave vote surged. These weren't just cultural anxieties, they were material wounds. Towns were stripped of industries, young people left for bigger cities, and services followed them out. And when the system feels rigged, messages, any message that promises control, take back control in the UK sense, it starts to resonate. And psychology helps us see why. Because economic shocks don't just thin your bank account, they thin your patience, they thin your trust, and they definitely thin out tolerance. They activate a scarcity mindset, a sense that what little remains must be protected. And under pressure, our identities harden, and belonging becomes conditional, and scapegoats multiply. And I see this in my own circles. Friends who once spoke about opportunity now speak about competition. People who once shrugged at immigration now mutter about pressure on services. It's hard to get a doctor's appointment, a dentist's appointment. Going to the NHS for anything now feels like a struggle. These aren't abstract ideas anymore. They are the emotional fingerprints of economic fragility. And this is why anger right now, all the anger I see, can't be explained as irrational, which I see happening a lot, not just in politics, but also in my field too, in mental health. Like there's a real division in the therapy world between what they see and how they respond to it. My position, what we see, it is rational, if painful, to want stability. The danger is that instead of aiming at the system that produced the insecurity, the blame gets redirected. It gets redirected towards migrants, towards the poor, towards the neighbour who looks different to you. And history shows what happens when we allow that blame to keep carrying on and to intensify, and more people to feel it. And I'm going to explore that in the next section. Hopefully by now we can see that economics and politics kind of come together. And they can explain a lot, but not everything, I think. Because if it were just about lost jobs or shrinking paychecks, anger might look more like class solidarity, the working class versus the upper class. I know in other societies it's not as strong or pronounced as it is in UK, but what you would see is Labour being annoyed and angry at the owners of production. But what we see here, and I think what we see in US, and I'm sure wherever you are, you might be seeing this too, we see it wrapped in flags, we see it sung in chants, painted on roundabouts. Something deeper than economics is being defended here. And I think what it is that tricky, elusive thing called identity. Now, political scientists Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris call it cultural backlash. Over the past half century, many societies have undergone what they describe as a silent revolution, a long shift towards liberal, cosmopolitan values, more emphasis on diversity, gender equality, sexual freedom, environmentalism. But every revolution leaves behind those who never signed up for it. For some, the pace of change has felt less like progress and more like dislocation. The authority of tradition has been questioned, and hierarchies that held people in place have become unsettled, and familiar cultural markers of what made you think who you were are fading. And when that happens, the psychology of belonging really starts to kick in. The more fragile one's sense of place, the sharper the need to draw boundaries between us and them. Now, again, really important here, this isn't about caricaturing voters as ignorant or bigoted. It's about understanding different moral foundations. Research shows that while some people place highest value on care and fairness, others lean more heavily on loyalty, authority, and purity. And when rapid social change challenges those values, blurring gender roles, unsettling national narratives, increasing visible diversity, it can feel like moral decline, even an existential threat. That's why populist slogans so often look to history to find inspiration. Take back control, make America great again. Nostalgia offers psychological shelter. It restores a sense of order and purity and loyalty, the values often most threatened, or what we feel are most threatened by change. And this is where the psychology and politics meet in the streets. Not to sound poetic, that wasn't poetic, but austerity might set the stage, but it's the sense of cultural loss that writes the script. Anger becomes way less about wages and more about symbols. It's less about policy and more about who belongs. I feel this in moments when friends who once argued about jobs now argue about flags, when people who never mentioned immigration suddenly talk about our culture being under siege. What's really being defended is not just material security, but a way of life people feel is slipping away. But here's where I struggle. What exactly is being lost? Is it Sunday afternoons in streets and pubs where everyone spoke the same language? Is it shops where everyone knows your name? Is it communities where you can walk safely through? A certainty about the order of things, who works where, who belongs where, what the future looks like. And is it really gone, or does it just feel like it? The research that I found tells us that societies in many, many ways are way more tolerant, safer, and more open than before. Yet the perception of decline is powerful enough to shape politics, which makes me wonder, perhaps what's slipping away isn't a set of practices or traditions, but a sense of stability, the feeling that the world will remain recognisable tomorrow is starting to seem way less likely. I touched upon earlier what happened in Germany in the 1930s and how radio was a kind of multiplier. And the same thing applies today. Like if it was radio in the 30s, a new medium, intimate and immediate, capable of reaching into kitchens and bedrooms, played a massive role in how Germany turned down. And what we found was that Nazi Party support was way higher in areas where radio was stronger, and also violence against Jewish people way more likely in areas with better radio signals. Technology didn't create the fear, but it tuned it to a frequency that was impossible to ignore. In the late 20th century, the amplifier became cable news. 24-hour channels turned politics into a constant feed, with fear and outrage as reliable ratings drivers. Studies in the US show that the arrival of Fox News in a local market nudged Republican vote share up by 0.4 to 0.7 percentage points. Small numbers that in close elections matter a lot. Even something as simple as where the channel appeared on a TV guide made a difference. The medium reshaped not just what people heard, but what they thought was normal. And now we live inside the third amplifier, the internet, social media more precisely. Unlike radio or cable, platforms aren't just broadcasters, they're engineers of attention. Algorithms privilege what sparks emotion. False stories travel way faster and deeper than true ones, especially when they provoke fear, anger, or disgust. YouTube, WhatsApp, Twitter, X if you want, Facebook, all have been implicated in pushing extremist content further and faster. And some studies find that algorithms funnel users towards more radical materials, whereas others suggest the real engine is us, humans sharing what outrages us the most. Either way, the outcome is the same. Anger just gets amplified. And what makes this moment different from earlier cycles is the intimacy of the information. Radio was one to many. Cable news was many to many. But platforms today are me to me. Tailored outrage tuned precisely to my fears, my identity, my sense of loss. The flags on the roundabouts, the marches on the streets, they don't just happen. They are seeded, spread, and strengthened by technologies that profit from keeping fear loud and ever present. The medium doesn't invent the anger, but it multiplies it until it feels like it's the only story in town. Okay, to just sort of try and capture where we are at the moment. So what I've tried to do is talk about how history gives us the rhythm, economics and technology set the stage, and psychology explains why the same tune keeps finding an audience. It tells us what happens inside the mind when the ground beneath us starts to feel unsteady. And at its core, politics is not just about policies? Yes. It's about managing fear. When the future feels uncertain, the psyche, us, wants clarity. I see this in my therapy room all the time in very small personal ways. We hate uncertainty and we cannot tolerate ideas that allow us or force us to accept that we have little to no control. So these small individual ideas push us to crave sharper categories: right and wrong, friend and enemy, us and them. Psychologists call this the need for cognitive closure. It's the desire for certainty, even if it comes at the cost of complexity. Threat just amplifies that need. Economic shocks trigger scarcity thinking. If there isn't enough to go around, I must protect what's mine. Identity anxieties add another layer. If my group's status is slipping in its importance, I double down on loyalty and belonging. Social identity theory tells us that when self-esteem is tied to group membership, any perceived loss by the group feels like a personal wound. And that's why populist narratives always resonate so powerfully. They are taking their jobs, they are taking your culture. It's not about rhetoric, it's a direct hit to the brain's threat circuits, if you like. Fear sharpens, anger mobilizes, belonging becomes conditional. Who is in must be defended, and who is out must be excluded. And moral psychology deepens this picture. Research by psychologist Jonathan Haidt and others shows that conservatives tend to weight values like loyalty, authority, and purity more heavily than liberals or people on the political left, because I realise that the word liberal can mean different things these days. So those people on the political left, if you like, tend to lead towards fairness and care. But when change is rapid, new norms, new neighbours, new symbols, it can feel less like progress and more like desecration. The rhetoric of purity, of order, of restoration is the buffer, the counter to what people perceive is a threat to them and their sense of self, even if those threats are broadly to create more tolerant society. It doesn't matter. If it's perceived as a threat, then a threat it is. And what I think strikes me about researching this piece is how much of this is about perception as much as it is about reality. The data, as I said before, tells us that societies are a lot more safe, a lot more tolerant, a lot more prosperous than previous generations. But psychology is here to always remind us that what matters politically is not what is, but what people feel. And when enough people feel unsafe, uncertain, or unseen, anger almost always follows. And the far right always knows how to translate that anger into power. So hopefully now we can start to see that this is not just an isolated incident. Economic crises, cultural backlash, fear of loss, we've seen them all before. But this cycle feels heavier, louder, and way harder to escape. Why? Why is that the case? I think, for me personally, there are three reasons why it's way harder to escape what's happening now. The first is the attention economy. Outrage isn't just an accident of politics, it's now a business model. Social media platforms are built to reward engagement, and nothing engages like fear and anger. Falsehoods spread faster than truth does, especially when they provoke a certain disgust or outrage. And the result is a public sphere, I think, that's tilted towards the most extreme emotions, just endlessly amplified till your eyes start to melt. The second is the intimacy of targeting. Radio was about broadcasting to millions, cable news is about reaching you in your house, but social platforms whisper directly just to you. Each feed is tailored, each piece of anger is curated to fit your identity, your fears, your worldview. Closed networks like WhatsApp make these messages harder to trace, harder to counter, and more powerful within tight communities that aren't being looked over or surveyed by others. And the third is, I think, the collapse of shared authority. Once people argued about the same set of facts, however imperfect they were, now media ecosystems are so fragmented that entire communities live inside parallel realities. The very idea of truth has become negotiable. Alternative facts, as I remember Trump's former press secretary once talked about. Trust in institutions, trust in the government, the press, even science has frayed, which means that without a common anchor, competing identities and narratives drift further apart and become harder to reconcile. And that's why this moment feels more total for me. We're not just debating policy, we're living inside engineered atmospheres of suspicion. And it's not just that we are angry, it's that anger has been given a megaphone, a feedback loop, and I think what's particularly disastrous about social media, a profit incentive. And it's why the marches and the flags and the graffiti don't just feel like social outbursts, they feel omnipotent, they feel constantly on. And I think because people can make money out of it. People can make money out of anger and rage, and I'm going to look at that in the next section. Okay, so my background is a tech journalist. I spent a long time covering social media and all these sorts of things, and historically the way they worked was they were trying to help you find people that you liked, find content that you liked, and connect you two together. And the reason why they did that is because if you dwelled more on the platform, you gave more data, more time, you became a product that they could then learn to sell ads to and to open up your data to advertisers to get hold of and to target really, really precisely. What's newish, is money on social media. So before it was just bragging rights and follow accounts, and maybe there were brand partnerships that came out of your audience size. But what's new is this noose between social media and money has been tightened. Whereas before the money came from third-party advertisers, now the platforms themselves want to pay you. YouTube has done this for a very long time, but Instagram and TikTok and X have all found their own unique strategies for rewarding you financially for content. And on X in particular, which has become a kind of hotbed for a lot of these ideas, you can make a good amount of money promoting whatever is popular or whatever makes you angry or rage baity. And there was an investigation recently that looked at who were running the biggest accounts of like far right ideology in the UK. I think one was a guy in Dubai, and another guy was a guy in Pakistan. Both essentially the targets of all this anger. They were brown-skinned men who didn't live here, but what they realised was your rage, your anger was profitable. And we saw this in 2016, the first round of Trump. We saw how in Eastern Europe, in places like Macedonia, these teenagers spun up sites and targeted far-right ideas, made loads of money. Didn't care about what that did to society that they weren't part of, but they did it. And that's an important point to make in this story, is that the fourth newness, if you like, is money, right? If I can make myself rich by making you angry, why not? And I think that is the sort of a thing that people find it hard to reconcile, that so much of the rage at the moment is being amplified and spread and all the other stuff because, quite simply, there's money to be made. Now, before you all get totally bummed out about all this, I'm going to turn now to how to imagine a less angry future. I'm sure none of this is new or surprising to you. The marches, the rhetoric, the online nonsense. We've all been living inside it for what feels like an eternity. Recognising what's happening now is important, but over the past few weeks, I found myself asking a harder question. How do we imagine a less angry future? Because history shows us that anger rises in cycles. Psychology also shows us that cycles can be interrupted, and fear doesn't have to calcify into hatred. Like, it's not a destiny in the age that we live in. And in fact, the same levers that push people toward exclusion can be turned gently towards empathy and solidarity. So what I've done is I've gone and done a bunch of reading and pulled out what I think are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think, best ideas I've seen that can help reframe a lot of the stuff that we're going through. The first is contact as antidote. One of the most consistent findings on social psychology is that contact between groups reduces prejudice. Very simple. Especially when they meet as equals and work towards shared goals. Even imagined contact, like picturing a positive encounter with someone from an out-group, has been shown to soften attitudes. The second is narratives that reframe. Stories in this world matter a ton. When migrants are framed as neighbours, co-workers, contributors, not as threats, fear loses its grip. Political messaging that taps into values of loyalty and duty, not just fairness, can bridge divides rather than deepen them. 3. Economic security as psychology at scale. So hopefully you've listened to this article and heard that scarcity sharpens hostility, but what's important to know is safety loosens it. Policies that reduce inequality and precarity are not just economic fixes, but psychological interventions. A strong social floor lowers the temperature of politics. Let me put that another way. If you had everything you needed, if you had access to the things that were important to you, services worked, policing was effective, healthcare was good, would you be so bothered about immigration? Would you be so bothered about ideas of loss if you had everything you need? I think that's the most compelling answer I found was quite simple. If people didn't feel like they were losing something, they'd be far less concerned with new people arriving. Anyway, let's move on. Point number 4. Teaching comfort with complexity. This is education. Education that cultivates critical thinking and tolerance for ambiguity helps blunt the appeal of black and white answers. It's what I do every day in therapy. I help people work with the idea that there is no black and white. There's just a ton of insanely frustrating grey. And we need that on a national scale. We can need to have a citizenry that can hold uncertainty without collapsing into anger and polarised beliefs because they can't tolerate it. And last but not least, leadership that models calm. In every era, leaders set the emotional tone of how a country feels about itself. When authority figures choose inclusion over scapegoating, transparency over fear, it does ripple outward. And the opposite is also true, as I think we all know too well. None of this is easy, and none of it is instant, but I do hold on to the idea that moves shift, just as they always have. The same societies that turn inward in fear can, given time and the right conditions, turn outward in hope. The question is whether we can build those conditions deliberately, rather than waiting for the rhythm of history to change on its own. I think we have to be way more active if we're going to change how we feel now. When I think back to the marches we saw a few weeks ago in the UK, the hotels that got attacked, the crosses just painted on anything on the street, I still feel a real sense of unease about it all. And it's not just the anger on display, it's the sense that something larger is shifting, that the ground beneath us is moving, that my view of a kind of just and even world where people should be allowed to move where they see fit suddenly sounds extreme rather than the norm. And I had to remind myself that history tells us this isn't new. Crises do create fear, and fear seeks clarity, and politics of exclusion offers it in sharp relief. There is loads of evidence to suggest that, and psychology explains why these messages land, why friends I love are pulled towards harder lines, why entire societies tilt right when life feels unstable. But history also tells me that moods change. The same nations that once embraced anger and rage have, in other times, chosen solidarity. And that same human instincts that cling to scapegoats can, under different conditions, be drawn towards empathy and care. Nothing about this cycle is inevitable, which I think leaves us with a choice. We can see this moment as proof that we are trapped in endless recurrence, very depressing, or to see it as evidence that rhythms can be recognised, interrupted and rewritten. And that's why I have spent the last 2 weeks writing this piece, not to judge, not to stand apart, but hopefully to try and understand. And in understanding, to hold open the possibility that we might together imagine a less angry future. Now, if you've got this far, thank you so much. But there is a video I saw on social media by a woman. I will try and dig it out and put it in the comments. And she talked about the idea of taking a country back. Right, this is a slogan that has found huge weight in the UK, and variants of it I see it in other countries too. She made an amazing point, and she said, "Please take it back." And what she did is she listed all the things like your local library needs volunteers, your local care home needs people to come and sit with and be with the elderly. Your local civic centre is always looking for people to run courses and to teach people. They also offer those services to anyone too. Litter picking communities are everywhere. Gardening committees are everywhere that need people just like you. If you want your country back, please take it. Be involved in it. Don't just be angry about it. And I think that's what I wanted to leave this video with at the end, which is, if you want to change the world around you, do it. Please do it. Please go and help and improve the lives of your fellow street mates, town mates, villagers, whatever it is, by taking part, be involved, do something to help somebody else. And that's it. That's all I have to say on that. A little bit of a rant at the end, but hopefully I think that's the message I want to get across, which is, don't just sit and let this happen. You can change things if you want. Go and help people. Anyway, thanks for listening, watching, and I will see you next week.